this just was a kind of almost a hostile environment to anything that was a departure from the straight growth platform. And in fact, I think some of the people in newsfeed ranking even used the words user value was synonymous with usage time. In other words, we increased user value means that like people spent more time on the platform, and like that was viewed as being an inherent good, which again, like I'm not saying there might not be a correlation, but that seems, shall we say, like you're deliberately setting yourself up to miss things.
I'm Quinta Jurecic, a senior editor at Lawfare, and this is the Lawfare Podcast, December 20th, 2023. Today, we're bringing you an episode of Arbiters of Truth, our series on the information ecosystem. In 2021, the Wall Street Journal published a monster scoop, a series of articles about Facebook's inner workings, which showed that employees within the famously secretive company had raised alarms about potential harms caused by Facebook's products. Now, Jeff Horwitz, the reporter behind that scoop, has a new book out titled Broken Code, which dives even deeper into the documents he uncovered from within the company. He's one of the most rigorous reporters covering Facebook, now known as Meta, and we're excited to have him on the show to discuss his work. I sat down with Jeff along with Matt Peralt, the director of the Center on Technology Policy at UNC Chapel Hill, and also someone with close knowledge of Meta from his own time working at the company. The three of us discussed Jeff's reporting and debated what his findings tell us about how Meta functions as a company and how best to understand its responsibilities for harms traced back to its products. It's the Lawfare Podcast, December 20th. Jeff Horwitz on Broken Code and reporting on Facebook. So the book is a follow-up or expansion of sorts to your 2021 series with the Wall Street Journal called The Facebook Files, which is based in part on internal company documents that were provided to you by whistleblower Frances Haugen. Just to start us off, what did you find in that reporting and what led you to write this book?
I think what sort of those documents were a pretty key part of the journey on was trying to understand the choices that Facebook, now Meta, had made and how that shaped the experience and problems that users faced on its platforms and sometimes off, right? So I think like the rhetoric of the platform has always been like, this is just a neutral place where people post content and somehow, the stuff that is most of interest to them rises to the top. And that's, just simply not an accurate or full picture given, sort of the power that the company and its staff wields over what content succeeds, what features are deployed, what is prioritized in terms of the weighting of algorithms. And so like this was kind of an effort to sort of get into the mechanics. And that's something I've been working on for a while. Obviously, trying to sort of connect those mechanics to concerns about social media and in particular Meta's products effects on the world was kind of the goal. And I think I'd covered the company long enough to know that if you want to understand Meta, you had to be inside Meta, right? Like trying to study the platform externally is very much harder than an environment where you can just sort of run A/B tests. So kind of like that was kind of always the North Star in terms of where the information was going to be.
Yeah, I found this metaphor of machinery really helpful, sort of mechanics. And you have a sort of a mission statement, or what I read as a mission statement, partway through the book, where you describe watching the live reactions come in response to remarks about free speech that Mark Zuckerberg gave in 2019, and noticing that seemed to you that there was something distorted about the kinds of reactions that were surfacing and feeling. And I'll just quote you here, that what you weren't understanding was, and I quote, that beneath the surface of a platform where users could post and interact was a hell of a lot of machinery. Servicing it would surely require professional mechanics, people who understood how the components worked and what to do when they broke. And your reporting is really about understanding those mechanics and that machinery. And I find that so interesting in part because I feel like I don't actually see a lot of that type of reporting when it comes to Facebook and social media companies. So can you talk about why that angle is so important and how that sort of informs what you're doing here in the book?
Yeah, and I think some of this goes back to sort of when I started covering the company, which was early 2019. I came from covering politics. I almost sort of had been like I paid attention to this stuff because it was relevant to just the world in general. Tech reporting kind of took over all the other types of reporting to some degree. But I think I in some ways benefited from not having sort of been steeped in some of the prior theories about what social media issues might be, right? So like, in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election, it was like, oh my God, the problem with social media is that the Russians have, figured out how to use it for psychological control. Or the problem with social media is that Cambridge Analytica got a hold of everyone's personal data. And I think those things, I'm not saying that those things weren't notable events, but just that I think there was a lot of time spent trying to figure out sort of what's wrong, and also a lot of time just spent fighting over content moderation decisions, right? Like up or down, should this piece of content exist on the platform? And I think those kind of missed the point. I think the thing I really loved about the Mark Zuckerberg October 2019 free speech address is that like, here you have a guy talking about the absolute importance of being able to sort of like challenge, the democratizing force of social media and how, they would, never censor anything. And at the same time, like the damn comments are just like censored to hell and back. Like they literally all involve the words like, thank you, love, congratulations. Like those were the only comments that were making it through, like with very few exceptions. And, obviously I understand that you do have to filter public speakers' stuff for hecklers because the internet's great at heckling. But the thing is, they were filtering and they were filtering everything. And, there were choices being made. And so it wasn't like so much a like maniacal entity that was like trying to, control what people said or thought or communicated so much as it was an entity that had designed a system that very clearly had impacts and like big impacts on how information spread, but that was not being ever transparent about it, right? I mean, like you'd ask Facebook, try to walk me through feed ranking. And it's like, oh, we connect you with the people and things you care most about. And then you'd be like, wait, what the hell does that mean? Like, that is not a thing. Like, how does it actually work? And they'd be like, we connect you with the things you care most about. And that was not a very helpful thing. And right, I think that was like kind of the origin of this stuff, is that it was very apparent that the mechanics, like that these things weren't neutral platforms, that they were machinery, that they were, a compilation of decisions, some of them philosophical, some of them extremely pragmatic, that had sort of produced a system for content recommendation. And, I think overwhelmingly, maybe it obviously wasn't what social media was in like 2007, 2008. Like that platform was pretty basic. Recommendations sort of really didn't exist in the form they exist now. But, at this point, this is a curatorial and recommendation engine primarily with some social network features added on top. It's not a social network that occasionally suggests content.
You talk about being outside the company and feeling like you didn't have a strong understanding at one point of the machinery. And then I think this book makes clear that now you're in a different position. In Facebook incredibly well. The personalities, the structure, many of the details about complex internal decision-making and data. And you actually know it so well that we've had a running joke together over the last couple of years about you knowing it better than I do, even though I worked there for a long time.
You could have spent more time poking around workplace in unauthorized places, Matt.
That's true. That is definitely
This is
true.
the secrets of reporting right here.
Yeah. As an employee, I was a little allergic to workplace. But I'm curious about the reporting process that you used to develop that understanding. So how did you go from being at this place where you felt like an outsider to using the reporting process then to get to a place of deep understanding?
I mean, this is classic for any investigative stuff. Is you start from the outside in, right? So, you find the people who have been cited in the newspaper as having some level of experience, and maybe they worked there in 2015, and you start figuring out what they know, and then they tell you who to talk to, and then sort of you kind of try to just keep on circling until you find, people who sort of actively have current information. And I think that like it was I think I describe myself in the book as like having become a groupie for anyone who understood like basically content ranking and recommendation systems. And that took a few years. I would say starting out on this beat was super rough because, everybody else had sources, I didn't. And I think, part of this is specialization, right? So like instead of going into I think there are a whole bunch of things you could have looked at. You could have looked at, the VR world. You could have looked at like various political things, content moderation focus. It was just like, okay, like actually what stays up and what comes down and the converse of that are like actually a lot less important than the question of what gets amplified in the first place and how things are transmitted. And so like, getting people to explain to me that like, the more you reshare content, or the more content gets reshared, the more sensationalism / factual accuracy concerns arise. I would never have suspected that was a thing. It makes sense in hindsight that, kind of like chain letters, right? Like, the old like email, Bill Gates is going to give you $1 million if you forward this to everyone in your address book stuff. Like there is sort of a loss of quality over time. And things like that, though, like I don't think I understood just the basic principles. And, I think to some degree, a big part of me learning about it was finding people who had been frustrated they couldn't change it, right? I mean, I often joke that like the biggest single asset I had in covering this company was that Facebook hired a bunch of tremendously intelligent, motivated people to study the defects of its platforms. And then it left a lot of them feeling very much ignored. And that's how you create a source for me, right? Is like nobody wanted to talk to me. These are people who get paid a ton and have great jobs and, their colleagues are nice and it's interesting work. Talking to a reporter, you don't mess that up, right? Like you don't want to mess that up. But that said, like I think the company made a significant portion of its staff so disillusioned by its own approach that candidly it was pretty easy.
So it seems like over time, as you're describing it, as you got closer and closer to the company, you developed more respect for at least some of the people who are there. But as I read the book, what was striking to me is it seemed like you developed less and less respect for the institution. And that movement is a little bit contrary for me to how I assumed someone's views would unfold as they got to learn more about the company and more about social media. I've always thought that the deeper your understanding, the more you'd have empathy because the decisions are just so complicated and so many of the decisions have significant costs associated with them. I think that it can often be hard to understand exactly what the right one is. And the more you learn, the closer you are to some of those challenges. But it seems like you went in a different direction as you learned more.
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. There are hard trade-offs to be made in social media and in platform design. I just think that Meta frequently didn't even get to them.
Well, and there's one line. There's one line in the end of your intro that I thought was really powerful. You say toward the end that based on what you were learning, it was getting harder to assume good intent. So what was it that you were seeing in your reporting that was making it seem more along the lines of there's acting in bad faith as opposed to there's complex decision making, and that's really challenging?
Well, okay, so certainly it doesn't start out that way. I think look, there's like it might have started out a little over optimistic, right? Like think back to like the aughts when Mark Zuckerberg is saying that Facebook is going to solve terrorism because people, once they're fully online and using Facebook a lot, will be so interconnected they can't hate each other anymore. And obviously that didn't work out. But I think so. Like they started out, I think, and perhaps it was a very convenient Pollyanna-ish point of view, which is we're getting rich and making the world better, and everyone feels good about everything. And I think it kind of it makes sense that like this company would have just the move fast and break things makes a ton of sense. Approach makes a ton of sense when you're kind of in a brand new like media technological space, and there's a land grab going on, which there most certainly was, right? So like. Being the guys who are like, I don't know, should we test this for another 3 months? That's a loser move under those circumstances, right? Like it makes sense that the mentality that Facebook's leadership team had was going to be the winning mentality in what was essentially a land grab or a land rush. Like, and so they just kind of built the thing and they optimized it for usage, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do if you're setting out to build a consumer product. And I think that you can kind of get to where the company got with pretty good intent, or at least certainly without any sense of maliciousness or of disregard or negligence. The problem is that they started, like, pretty clearly it became apparent that the optimization work they've been doing for growth was actually contrary to optimization for both user safety and even what users actually told the platform they wanted from it. And I think it's pretty stark when you see the company telling its safety staff that they have literally zero budget to affect engagement, like that daily active people, right, daily usage numbers just can never be like damaged by any measurable amount, right? Even like 0.05%, that's unacceptably high as a cost. At that point, like, okay, like you can say you're really focused on doing safety work, but if you're what exactly is the trade-off if you're not willing to trade off against growth? And I think that, it's very, very hard to find instances in which the company took a meaningful hit to growth. Like, and by meaningful, I mean even measurable, right? Not like big. I think like at some point I would have assumed that look, it's a company, it's supposed to take care of itself, but like that there was truly no budget for integrity work, to really like damage growth. And in fact, that somehow that things just kept shipping that the integrity people could see were making known integrity problems worse. It's just kind of hard to say, oh, well, there are tough trade-offs here. Like, I'm sure that there would be tough trade-offs, but like the answer is, are we willing to do anything that would be detrimental to growth ever? And if the answer to that is like no, then I don't know that you're getting to tough trade-offs.
So that leads really nicely into something I wanted to ask you, which is if you could kind of spell out what you mean by integrity, right? Because this is, I think, something that is so key to your reporting into the book, is the way that the work that we're sort of calling with a broad brush integrity here is spread out through Facebook as an organization, and how those sort of organizational and institutional politics work. For the lawyers who are listening to this, I'll make a joke that, Facebook is not a unitary executive, right? There's a lot of different, ultimately at the end of the day, Mark Zuckerberg may be the one who makes the decisions, but there are a lot of different moving pieces that really shape what happens and how. And I think what your reporting shows is how the sort of arc of this kind of integrity, trust and safety work, whatever you want to call it, shapes and is shaped by the other institutional incentives. So what are these people who are working in this space that we're calling integrity?
Yeah, and I think they kind of came up with that name kind of on their own. I think in a way that sort of like makes clear that this is something somewhat different than like past content moderation, for kind of the open internet. Right? Like, I think that, there's always been people, since the days of Yahoo message boards who had the job of like being like, okay, no child sex abuse. All right. Like, nope, you did it. Okay, we're going to have to report you to law enforcement, taking your stuff down. Right? Like, that's always existed. And so there's always been some safety people. I think integrity and sort of that name was a nod to the idea that, the web 2.0, sort of the social media world couldn't be adequately governed simply by just like taking down the bad stuff when you found it. That this was in some ways a question of platform design and also of network behavior. And that, like you had to look at sort of how communities formed, how they grew, how they recruited. And that sort of all of this was kind of like part of a much bigger picture that kind of was going to have to be like completely rejiggered in terms of like the approach of safety in social media was going to have to be different than safety and, I don't know, the comments in the Wall Street Journals below a Wall Street Journal article. And, I think that like recognition is a pretty key one. And interestingly enough, one that it oftentimes seems like company leadership really doesn't want to recognize very much. Like, I think the way that, Mark in that 2019 speech and subsequently has sort of discussed this stuff is like, well, like we can either let our platform do whatever it does, or we must censor, right? And like, that's not the case. Like I think some of the, the key things that people integrity were doing, like they were saying like, oh guys, like it looks like when we allow people to friend 200 people a day and we're actually encouraging people to friend 200 people a day, that's going to be bad for the overall quality of integrity on the platform. Or like, maybe having people opted into groups whenever they like a group post, like just like automatically they get joined, is going to result in some crappy growth. Or, there's any number of things. Or like maybe things that get reshared dozens of times in a row, aren't necessarily, don't need to be boosted hard. These are all sorts of questions that I think are integrity questions. They're not like traditional safety questions. And so that kind of that name, it's a little amorphous, and I think almost intentionally so, because it was developed by people who were not clear on like exactly what the parameters were for sort of this new world they were kind of responsible for.
One of the themes in the book, I think, is you're making like a pretty sophisticated set of data arguments that when you measure certain things and then you have value judgments based on what you measure, you get outcomes that are consistent with those measurements. And sometimes that means if you're measuring the wrong things or you're measuring the right things, but in the wrong way, you get problematic results. So I think there's like a little bit of a Moneyball type dynamic to your book, which I really liked. Moneyball is the book by Michael Lewis that looked at how baseball inaccurately valued certain metrics over others.
I will take 100th of his sales, just 100th of Moneyball's sales. I will happily take. Keep going.
So I'm wondering if you can go into this a little bit. Like one of the details in the book is, just to provide listeners with an example, is you talk about how Facebook was measuring aggregate usage, which didn't account for how bad actors might skew the data. Essentially, you were saying it's the difference between looking at the mean or the average versus the median. And then another example is the launch of the meaningful social interactions metric. And you go into some detail about the problems, not with the concept itself, but with its implementation and the way that that metric was actually brought to life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think let's start with sort of the way the companies described it, and then we can talk about what might be a little closer to reality in some of these instances. Which is that, I mean, the company's described itself, like Mark came up with the term, the fifth estate, right? The idea being that this is like this kind of fundamental democratic institution, that everyone has a voice on the platform, that is kind of like, this is like Vox Populi, but immediate, and, a referendum on everything. And, I think, yeah, absolutely. Anyone in the world can log on, and anyone in the world can like something, and them, liking or sharing something is going to sort of alter the way things go on the platform in terms of how far content spreads. But that's sort of, okay, so like, if we start with that just everyone's going to have some impact on the platform, the question is how much impact and how is that levied, right? And so one could set it up so that every user has roughly the same impact. Maybe people who use Facebook 4 hours a day have more impact than people who use Facebook 2 hours a day. But, everyone has some sort of roughly proportional similar impact. That's not the way it was designed. The way it was designed is just aggregate number of actions, right? So if you are just literally posting 200 comments per hour, your commenting is going to have 200x the power of someone who has only posts one comment per hour. Like it was designed that way, just truly linear. And I think some people, one of the I think a character in the book, Carlos Gomez-Uribe, he's actually a real person, not just a character. But he came in with the idea that was put in part of feed ranking integrity, that like actually the best way to sort of fix some of the problems were to perhaps give the hyperactive users a little bit less power. And maybe if they did actually shift from every action weighs the same to every user's actions net weigh the same or something closer to it, that they would actually make it a lot harder to manipulate the platform. And this was proposed. It would have significantly reduced how much polarizing content spread around the platform, because it turns out that highly polarized users are the platform's heaviest users. It would have reduced misinformation, because it turns out that the people who are just like banging the keyboard are not the most reliable sources of information. And, I think it would have like basically done a lot of the things that I think the company addressed, a lot of the things the company was fighting over the years as problematic behavior. And Mark Zuckerberg just hated it. Allowed it to go through only watered down by an 80% margin. And, there's no reason, this is just fundamental. It's just how do you count the value of an interaction? And the way Facebook always has counted the value of interaction. And there's been some easing of this, some capping in recent years. But traditionally the way Facebook does that is every interaction is worth the same. Please take as many actions as possible. And that to people who had experience elsewhere in the world, whether that was Carlos Gomez-Uribe at Netflix or Michael McNally, who worked at Google. I mean, these people understood that I think one of the hallmark rules of running anything on the internet is that your most hyperactive users are always your worst ones, right? The people who leave 60 reviews on Amazon per hour, burn them all, right? None of those reviews are worth anything. The people who send 20,000 emails over the course of a day, right? Whereas with Meta, outside of some very minimal, extreme spam porn, Ray-Ban glasses type stuff, the more you acted, the more Meta liked you and the more deference it gave you. And that's a choice that isn't really democratic, right? I mean, they only let you vote once per election, right? And it's one that I think fundamentally skewed the platform, and that to some degree, I think is almost a starting point for where some of these things went wrong.
So I want to dig maybe a little bit more into this and kind of go beyond what you've described in terms of the substantive choices that are made and into the kind of institutional dynamics in making those choices, which have to do with folks who do integrity work saying often, this is going to lead to some really bad stuff down the line, or if they're not initially consulted, then looking at it with horror when it's brought to them, and then other portions of the company pushing back for a variety of reasons. And I do want to say, I think that this kind of these institutional dynamics and institutional dysfunction is something that I found really fascinating about the book, and I think comes to a head in this sort of moment to kind of skip ahead in the story when you describe Frances Haugen's sort of final act before she leaves the company as downloading the org chart to hand over to you, that I think really brings home just how central these institutional dynamics are. So how does that kind of play out, this push and pull between integrity and kind of everybody else in those decisions that you're describing?
Yeah, look, as I said earlier, I don't think there was a recognition initially that integrity work and growth work were going to be at loggerheads as often as they were. I think there is this nice simplistic version of if we run a good, safe, healthy platform, then more people are going to use it. And that's kind of true. But that said, it's only true within limits. And it turns out that one, having a, nice, friendly, well-lit platform is hard to do, and two, that it is expensive, and three, that it actually does come at some, at least near-term measurable usage growth. And I think that's, again, another place where the metrics thing just rears its head, which is the way that Facebook has traditionally measured whether something is good or bad for users is does making a change make usage metrics or engagement metrics go up in the next 3 to 4 weeks? And if the answer to that is yes, then they do it. Now, there's definitely some theoretical categories of very unhealthy growth. And in fact, actually some of the integrity people did demonstrate later on that they were not getting credit for changes they made that did have long-term healthy impact on the platforms that, increased usage in healthy ways. So I don't think they realized the degree to which integrity and growth teams were going to be at loggerheads on a regular, ongoing basis, right? That at least in terms of near-term impact, and long-term is a different matter, but at least in terms of near-term impact, pretty much everything the integrity people wanted to do was going to be bad for distribution or bad for engagement. And the reason for that is that the platform was already optimized as perfectly as they were capable of to maximize engagement. So any departure from that path was going to come at a loss. And at least in terms of what they couldn't measure immediately. So you have this kind of tug of war, except the problem is in terms of staff numbers, number of staff, in terms of clout. this thing is just wildly lopsided. Like, I think that something that's like still amazes me is that, the content moderation policy people, they rolled up to the lobbyists, and the integrity and safety staff rolled up to the growth team, right? Like, these are not equal footing operations, right? And so, like, I think what happened just very regularly was that whenever there was a disagreement over what was good for users, it would end up being adjudicated by someone who was generally more interested in the company's standard growth metrics than it was in the stuff that the integrity people were pushing. And they didn't win most of the fights they drew. I think, like, there's kind of, I used to joke with people who worked there that if they had a great idea that got shot down, that they should just wait 2 years, and that maybe then at that point they would, the company would pick it up. But like, this just was a kind of almost a hostile environment to anything that was a departure from the straight growth platform. And in fact, I think some of the people in newsfeed ranking even used the words user value was synonymous with usage time. In other words, we increased user value means that, like, people spent more time on the platform, and like that was viewed as being an inherent good, which, again, like, I'm not saying there might not be a correlation, but that seems, shall we say, like you're deliberately setting yourself up to miss things.
The book ends with kind of a bit of a twist. I wouldn't say I gasped, but it was definitely a surprise, where you kind of reveal, as you've hinted at, that despite this very data-driven focus on growth over and at the expense of, you argue, integrity, it turns out that the company has actually been mismeasuring the effects of integrity policies, and in the long term, they seemingly actually grow platform use. So I'm curious how, sort of what you made of that late stage development, and looking forward, whether you think there's hope that might actually change how the platform functioned and is governed.
I mean, it's just like so depressing, right? I think for people who did the integrity work, it was extremely deflating. I mean, in some ways it was like reanimating. It proved the point that they've been trying to make for years. But on the other hand, like, the company had been making decisions based on what was good for growth, and they'd been making them wrong based on what this research showed. And like, I think the fascinating thing was how the company initially responded, right? Is this had been set up by integrity staffers and core data science people, just trying to sort of like answer the question of like, well, if users want what you're doing, why do they use the platform less when we do it? And the fascinating thing was that you could see a chart. All the integrity stuff tended to, in the first 6 months, it was a net negative for usage. The 6 months later, it had come back to zero, right? In other words, there was no longer, integrity changes made a year before, no alteration, no loss. And then after that, it turned positive. And so this doesn't say that, like, it doesn't say exactly how a platform should be run. But what it does say is that the line between growth and safety that the company had, it wasn't where the company thought it was. And in fact, that, like, very clearly, the integrity interventions should have been stronger. How much stronger? Hard to say. Like, at some point, obviously, a perfectly safe platform is a perfectly boring platform, and you can definitely overdo it. But the company, what this stuff demonstrated was the company was clearly underdoing it. And I think the response to that work was kind of fascinating. It was like kind of awkward. It wasn't shared that broadly. And like, as soon as this finding came out, they spent 6 months basically before they were even allowed to share it, because management wanted that thing red teamed. Because to some degree, this is like a pretty provocative thesis, which is that the company has like literally been optimizing for nothing, if that makes sense, or optimizing for something negative for growth, negative for, like user sentiment, negative for user well-being, however you measure that. And I don't think, you don't want to overstate it and say that like, oh, everything should be 180 degrees different. But like, very clearly the company's own metrics here were skewed in favor of anything that was going to provide a short-term hit. And, I think one of the most fascinating things about that research was it found that the biggest gains in usage were coming from irregular users and new users. Right, like namely the most valuable users that the platform could have. Right, it turns out that this was turning off people who would have spent more time on a healthier platform.
So I want to pivot to the Facebook files. And I think there's obviously an extensive public record out there on the substance of the files, you do at least initially to your reporting, the journal's reporting. I think probably lots of people who are listening are familiar with that public record. But one of the things that I thought was really extraordinary about the book, it was really fascinating to me, is the behind the scenes narrative that you tell about some of the specific decisions around publishing, around working with Frances Haugen, around her interactions with an organization called Whistleblower Aid, and all these little decisions that, or I shouldn't say little, individual decisions as well as big decisions. I mean, a lot of decisions that had a big impact around the specific mechanics of how you brought that information out into the light. Is that something you could talk a little bit more about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, look, it was my relationship with Frances, I think was extremely, like, we spent a lot of time together. We talked for months before sort of things really began on the scale that they ended up. You know, this is covered in the book, I spent, 3 weeks plus in Puerto Rico, basically like almost as like a colleague in the sense that like, we'd meet every day and talk about what she was finding when she was sort of doing her probe of workplace, Facebook Workplace. During that period of time, she accumulated the vast majority of the 20,000 plus pages of things that she gathered, I believe. And I think it was first of all, tremendous respect to her as source. I've never had somebody, I think I covered this in the book, like most of the time, people who get frustrated with the company or, sort of disillusioned, they burn out, they quit, and then they talk to a reporter. Frances knew that was going to happen to her if she did that. And it was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what I can while I'm still here. And that is a tremendously tough job. It's, kind of to some degree being it requires basically being surreptitious. It requires, risk of getting caught. And like, this is all like very psychologically hard. And she did it, to a level that was like amazingly dedicated, like to the point where like literally at the, in her final hours, I was like, all right, we're supposed to go to a celebratory dinner, Frances, let's get going. And like, I had to like go down and, pay the cab driver $20 to like wait because she was still, trying to view things like the last scraps in her remaining moments. And I think it's a difficult and weird transition to go from having a absolutely star amazing source to going to having a star whistleblower advocate source. Like these are different things, right? And different roles. And I think the question of what was the best way to present this stuff, obviously, like we had our approach. And the Wall Street Journal, by the way, is deeply slow. That is one of the inherent traits. And frequently that's a good thing. But, I think, there was definitely frustration on, sort of from people in her camp. Because she definitely did develop a bit of an entourage with sort of the speed that we were going. And I think we were frustrated to some degree with some of the choices in terms of like how to share the documents. There was this kind of consortium of other news outlets that were called in 3 or 4 weeks after we started publishing and sort of handed the thing. And I think, Frances, to her credit, one of the things that I think she wanted very much early on was for this stuff to be public record as much as possible, like for the information to be something that anybody anywhere in the world could review to at least understand what was happening with the platform and maybe build something better. And the journal didn't publish the documents itself for the most part, right? We published little excerpts. And that's something that I wasn't happy about at the time and definitely have not come around on. There were a lot of things that the journal did that were amazing and provided a lot of support and did, I think, like some really good editing and smart thinking about how to roll things out. And, my colleagues were amazing. I wish we'd been able to put out those documents. I think that was a tense thing, and to some degree it was it's no longer our baby, if that makes sense.
Well, and you had also spent months doing careful reporting, right? And going like very methodically through the documents, and then all of a sudden they're out in the public and reporters are trying to get stories out the door really quickly, right? Which is a very different style
Yeah,
of reporting.
this is the positive side of what I referenced to the Wall Street Journal being slow. Is that I think we are fairly cautious and fairly thorough. And I think there were some really great stories actually that came out from the rebranded Facebook papers. There were a few of them that I was like, oh yeah, that's an amazing angle. Like, either that's one that I didn't think of, or that we just didn't get to because hell, we wrote 50,000 plus words on in that series. So there was some really great stuff that came out of it. At the same time, I think there was a lot of kind of noise, and I worry sometimes that what came out of it was like Facebook bad scandal, as opposed to the social media internet does not have to be this way, and there are very particular things that have choices that have been made that fundamentally have skewed the experience and skewed its impact on the world in ways that, shall we say, were never open to a democratic vote.
So I have this very vivid memory of talking to you when you were working on this story, and you were asking for my feedback on some of the materials that you were seeing. And so you sent me some screenshots of the screenshots that Frances Haugen had taken, and we were talking through some of the substance. And I said at one point, independent of the substance, I now have a sense of how you got access to this story. I can see that it came via a leak. And at least from my standpoint, particularly because I had lived through years of leaking when I was at Facebook and had really felt that it had this deeply problematic impact on company decision-making and on the trust that you would have in your colleagues. I said that to you and talked a little bit about my concerns about it, and you had a different view. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that disagreement now. I mean, can you talk about your views on getting materials in this way?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if my view is 100% different in the sense that there was always going to be hell to pay. Frances knew that. I knew that. In fact, like one of the motivating things, that we talked about was that clearly the company was just sloppy as hell in terms of information control internally. Like they never knew how to, Facebook's never been great at search, right? So they literally couldn't find the stuff that was sensitive to lockdown, even after it became apparent that, there was a restive employee base.
But can I put a different spin on it, just in part, just for the sake of disagreement? But I actually think there are sort of twin values at work here. One is, I agree, you could frame it as not good at locking down sensitive information. And another is a transparent company culture where they wanted people at the company to be able to understand a whole bunch of different things based on the assumption that would be kept internal.
Oh, absolutely. Historically, I think the open, trusting company culture was actually really important and really valuable, and I think was an amazing trait of company culture. I think that, however, part of that trusting sort of culture is that people internally have to feel like decisions are being made in a reasonable way and with good intent. And if you lose that, then at that point, I think it becomes, and if you lose the faith that, let's say, the company is going to act in appropriate and responsible ways when presented with information, and is going to allow work to be done on sensitive subjects that, let the chips fall where they may. If you lose that sense, then I don't know how much value there is to having a open, company culture if, the work that gets done just gets ignored. To some degree, I think one of the reasons why, and I think, Frances and I think both understood that there was going to be quite a crackdown after all of this happened, because whatever mix of sloppiness versus, good transparency there was. And to be fair, if we're talking about a slide deck presentation from Meta's senior leadership to Mark about teen mental health with all of the comments in line, in review draft form, being available to 55,000 employees, that's not open, that's sloppy, right? Open is, I think, allowing good debate and people to share work and all of that. But, whichever mix it was, there's definitely a loss there. And afterward, there was a crackdown. But that said, it's also hard to say everyone should just completely, should leave Facebook documentation alone and internal, so they can continue to do research that people won't listen to. and leadership, right? That was kind of the issue. And so I don't think I have I'm not dogmatic about this. I don't think that leaking is always, the right thing to do. I do, however, think that if you are in possession of documentation that demonstrates serious, real harm that is unmitigated, and that is a choice not to mitigate, and that the company is not being forthright about those decisions and what those trade-offs are, I don't know. That seems like to me like a much easier call. And even if it's going to make things harder for colleagues, which it definitely did.
So one of the other subplots of the book is the sort of complicated dynamics, I guess I'll say, between Facebook or the social media ecosystem more broadly and journalism itself. Obviously, there are tensions between journalists and tech companies in terms of just dominance over the media ecosystem. But there's also a dynamic where, it can be kind of difficult to report well on social media companies because of those same dynamics that you're writing about in the book. There's an incredible anecdote where Adam Mosseri, who heads Instagram, has a sort of very measured, nuanced response to your reporting in an interview, which is then picked up and sort of splashed in a bunch of headlines in a way that completely misrepresents what he's saying, but is a lot better for sort of angry clickbait. So I'm curious how you thought about producing journalism that actually, tells people something new about Facebook without falling into this trap of producing outrage bait.
Yeah, look, I think if you read the book, you certainly might come away with the idea that some significant mistakes were made, or that there might be some intent issues that arise. But that said, I think one of the things was just focusing on the mechanics. The great news about these documents is that, while it's very hard to tell what social media's impact is on society at large, long term, right? Is social media causing polarization? Is it the primary cause of polarization? These are not things that really are ever going to be settled super easily, because you can't run a A/B test in which Facebook doesn't exist in an alternate world. But I think what you can do is tell very clearly that the company is making decisions that directly affect how and what content, how it bounces around the platform, what gets amplified, and that the company is vastly more powerful in terms of, setting up the system than, it would like to, than its status as a quote unquote platform might suggest. I think that for journalism about this stuff, I think it's very hard for things not to get contentious in some of this stuff. And I think there have been, definitely interest, the love-hate affair over, Facebook and journalism, I think is a fascinating one to write about, right? Which is that simultaneously people were saying you're corroding the entire ecosystem. And then Facebook actually tried making news less prominent, and, all the publishers screamed like hell, both, the, shall we say, the more respectable publishers and the fly-by-night ones. And so I don't know that we've ever sort of sorted out the relationship in the same way that and to some degree it's not that different, right? We are, both journalism and social media do try to maximize engagement. I think the difference is that the journalism side has a lot of humans in the loop, and we're also much less good at it. So there's both some element of editorial judgment that comes in that isn't just okay, whatever's going to maximize clicks for the day. And then there's also just a level of we're never going to be as competent at targeting information that will maximize engagement as a machine learning based ranking system.
So you end the book on a bit of a grim note, writing that you'd hoped that your reporting could force a reckoning for Facebook, but that it might have just added up to a lot of bad press. And then elsewhere, you also write that the story of, and this is a quote, the story of Facebook's integrity work is, in many respects, the story of losses, that the people you write about, and again, quote, uncovered flaws and helped mitigate awful outcomes, but they failed to persuade the world's largest social media company to fundamentally reevaluate how it built and managed its products. That's pretty grim. Is the story as grim as all that? Are there any signs that anything has changed either within Facebook or, among the ecosystem writ large in terms of, new companies that are being developed, other companies? Or do you see the landscape sort of continuing down the same path that you chart here?
I think, look, aside from the company pausing, quote unquote, Instagram for kids, I don't know that there are that many obvious things that we can cite that sort of emerged out of this. I think the DSA, Digital Services Act in the EU definitely, I think, bears some influence on this, or bears some influence from sort of Frances Haugen's documents and kind of the public understanding of them. But, nothing out of certainly the U.S. government ever really materialized to date. I think there's still an effort to work on child safety stuff. But, even though that was kind of an area that was kind of hailed as a bipartisan piece of common ground, I think if I'm thinking about things that are like really good that came out of it, I think one of them is that there is a very large collection of former staffers at the company who are like candidly fairly well trained via battle on the dynamics of platforms and how to design things responsibly and how to govern them responsibly, and that they are now talking. Right when I began this sort of effort to try to get to people who understand Facebook's mechanics, it was really few and far between in terms of people who would actually speak up. These days I could call like dozens of people who are out publicly discussing these things, like the Integrity Institute, and is certainly one of them. Also the Trust and Safety Professional Association. They long pre-exist this, but that they, I think there's a lot of expertise out there, and I think a lot of expertise that is now sort of consulting with regulators, running kind of experiments that demonstrate the weaknesses of various things, kind of duplicate some of the work that they did inside of the company. So I would say that like at this point, the mechanics stuff is now largely public record. Harvard's archive of these documents has actually gone live, and anyone can now get access to pretty much all of the findings that Frances Haugen documented. And so my hope is that that's going to be used by people who want to do things perhaps in a different way than Meta did, want to address, before they roll out features, the things that, Meta found out after the fact were the issues that arose from them. So I think that would be the sort of the main point of optimism, as opposed to that like somehow somebody came in and fixed social media or Meta or the internet. I don't know. I guess my hope is that for you start with the understanding of what these choices are and their implications, and then at that point something better comes out of it in the future, rather than that at the end of the day everything gets fixed and turnarounds occur where turnarounds are due or whatever.
Let's leave it there. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Arbiters of Truth, a Lawfare podcast series on the information ecosystem. You can find past episodes in the Lawfare podcast feed. The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare Materials supporter through our website, lawfaremedia.org/support. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. The podcast is edited by Jen Patja-Howell, and your audio engineer this episode was Kara Schillen of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thanks for listening.